colleagues of mine and we've been collecting some data about national identity for the last few years now. And we realized at some point that as we start talking more and more about democratic backsliding, there are a lot of insights that we can draw from this data to understand, make sense of this trend of backsliding in India, right? And that's interesting. Modi, of course, has made a big deal in the last few years, especially about how India is the mother of democracy. And even the election manifesto this time claimed that they will promote India's rich democratic traditions that go back to millennia. And he has, at various occasions, pointed to the Indian epics to find elements of democracy or democratic processes to support his claim. And this is in quite a lot of contrast with, so my clicker is not working. Just go to the next slide if you can. There we go. And this, the narrative from the Indian government and political leaders is in a lot of contrast with this more sort of global trend of identifying India as various, maybe a flawed democracy or even an electoral autocracy since 2016, where we have observed this trend of backsliding. And this, if we go to the next slide, is actually not unique to India. I'm sure everybody here is quite well aware that there is a global phenomenon of democratic backsliding. And the figures are really quite astonishing. So after the end of the Soviet Union, there was this wave of democratization, which eventually led to a peak of 43 liberal democracies in 2012. And that number is down to a surprising 32 in 2023. And only 13% of the global population currently lives in a liberal democracy. So this is very much a global trend of backsliding. And that's, of course, resulted in a very fruitful research area, revitalized research area in political science, trying to understand, well, what is driving this trend of backsliding, especially in democracies that were considered consolidated. And of course, also then try to understand what can help sustain liberal democracy after it has become consolidated, because it seems that that is no longer guaranteed, that once a country is a liberal democracy, it will remain a liberal democracy. And so there is sort of this spectrum of regime types, right? On one end, you have liberal democracies, which are, of course, they have elections, but they also have certain liberal rights that are protected, which includes equality before law, and also especially judicial and executive constraints, right? And then on the other end, you have a closed autocracy, systems where there are no multi-party elections, and usually a lot of absence of freedoms that we associate with liberal systems. So countries might move in either direction, understand how that happens. And so when it comes to what the received wisdom is, political scientists generally point to some factors for what helps democracy consolidate and endure. It's very important that a polity has at least 2 free and fair elections back to back, right? And then material capabilities are very important. And usually scholars have considered a per capita level of around 29,000 US dollars to be minimum requirement for helping sustain democracy. And then, of course, liberal institutions and checks and balances are also very important. And what makes this a little bit suspicious today is that the leading cause of democratic breakdown in recent years has actually been anti-democratic leaders being elected into office. So backsliding is happening in consolidated democracies because people are, for some reason, supporting more authoritarian and autocratically minded leaders, right? So they're being voted into office. And so what I suggest is that we focus so much on material and institutional factors of democratic consolidation that we've neglected ideas, right? So how people think about democracy and whether liberal values are consolidated in the realm of ideas that a society holds in common, that is very important for whether democracy and liberal democracy is going to endure after it has been once established. So people need to value liberties and freedoms, and that needs to be an essential part of how they think about themselves as citizens of their country, or how they think about their country itself. And so that is what we find or are trying to do with our data set. We've built a data set from 1950 to 2020 at 10-year intervals that tries to look for indicators of how people talk about what is India and what does it mean to be Indian. And the texts that we use for constructing this data set include leadership speeches, textbooks, especially for history and social science, newspapers, and here we focus much more on op-eds and letters to the editor to get a sense of how people are talking, what kinds of ideas are important. And we also look at actually best-selling novels and blockbuster movies. And these are mostly in English and Hindi, which unfortunately does not capture the full diversity of Indian linguistics. There are so many languages that are very widely used. But what it does is give us a very good insight into what is the hegemonic discourse in India, right? Because Hindi is the most widely spoken language, and English is still sort of the language of at least the educated elite discourse that seems to be quite hegemonic. So it gives us at least a very partial but rich insight into identity trends in India over time. And these are the top 10 identities over time in India, right? So democratic features very prominently, and Indians have for a very long time since independence taken a lot of pride in democracy. And very often, especially in the early years after independence, unsurprisingly, independence was a very important correlate. So people talked about democracy as something that has been hard won through the freedom struggle. And it is an essential feature of independent India, the freedom that India had to fight for. But at the same time, and quite interestingly for us, right from 1950, the fact that the Indian government is inefficient has been a very, very prominent identity as well. So people have always talked about India as having an inefficient government, having a corrupt government. People have also identified India as a very communal society, especially Indian politics, as something that further stokes communalism, right? Casteist. India is a casteist country. We are a casteist society. We are weak, especially economically. And that comes very closely with poor. So there is a huge self-awareness that we are a very poor country that has been struggling for a very long time, right? There's a lot of instability, and people have a sense of disillusionment. And that disillusionment has become more and more prominent over time. So in this mix of top 10 identities, there's a far more emphasis on sort of these negative identifications rather than more positive and optimistic ones. And so here I have some data about, visualized it, about democracy and some of the important correlates, right? And so the green line here is democracy. And how important it has been in the national identity discourse has varied over time. Some years it has been the top 3 or maybe even the most top identification. In other years, it has dipped quite low. And since 1980, we've seen a counter-identification emerge of a non-democratic and authoritarian India. So at times when democracy has dipped especially low here, and starting in 1980s, right, where Indira Gandhi's rule was a little bit moving into the more autocratic directions towards the end of her government, concerns started emerging that India was heading in a more non-democratic and authoritarian direction. And what's also interesting is this red line, which is the inefficient and corrupt government. And that moves very nicely with this democracy. So when democracy is particularly low, we see that this feeling that India's government is inefficient and corrupt, that feeling goes very, very high. And so these two are moving very, very closely with each other. And so the yellow line is disillusioned with politics, and that has also been very, very consistent. For us, it was interesting to see that in 1950, right, which is such a hopeful time in Indian society, the constitution is just coming into force, countries just become independent, going to start holding elections soon. And already people have a sense of disillusionment with Indian politics and how they think about the Indian politicians. And then, of course, independent has been a very important correlate of how India thinks about its democracy. And then here are some more social identifications. So the green line here is secular, and the dashed green line is communal, right? And I think over time, there has been somehow more of an emphasis on the sense that India is a very communal society, rather than this acknowledgement that we are secular. Secular has always been a hope and a dream that one day maybe we will become a secular society. While we are very plural and diverse, and that is something to be valued, we remain very much a communally divided society, divided along the lines of religion, and something that is actively worsened by the politicians. There's also casteist, which is the yellow line. Poverty and insecurity has been quite important as well in the red line. And then this blue line is, of course, equality and social justice. And so while it really received a spike in 2010, it's not that society has become more equal, but rather this is something that we need to aspire to as well. So all of these positive identifications are aspirations that India should become more equal. It should become more secular. But the reality is that we are a communal society, and we are very casteist, and it is very unequal and unjust in India because so many people are so poor. And this was also for us interesting to see where is democracy more important, because we look at different kinds of discourses in Indian society. And so consistently, Indian politicians talk about democracy a lot more than people talk about democracy. So the cultural representations, the movies and the novels, they don't really give us much of a sense of this pride in being a democracy, or even that this is something that is on the top of people's minds, something that politicians always remind us in their speeches. And from time to time, we see this pop up in the newspapers, especially in editorials. So editorials like to talk about the fact that India is a democracy, and they worry about the state of India's democracy. But people are not talking about that so much. What people are talking about a lot more in the blue line here, the fact that the government is inefficient and it's very corrupt. And that is something that our political leaders very, very rarely even acknowledge. In 1950, in the beginning, yes, people acknowledged that. It was something that India had to overcome through good governance, good laws. But more or less, leaders don't talk about the corruption and the inefficiencies. So just a little bit more sort of texture on how people have talked about democracy in India. It's an editorial from 1950 where there was a lot more hope. And this sense that the people who were in power had a lot of responsibility to actually deliver on the constitution, the democratic, liberally minded constitution that they had drafted, and the kind of life that they had promised people in exchange for independence and having a democratic system. But over the years, that shine has sort of gone away and been replaced by more of a sense of disillusionment. So a novel in 1970 talked about how the country's democracy is trapped in caste and religious-based politics. And in a letter to the editor, also in 1970, people talked about how the lower castes are being roasted by politics, right? And really how people are becoming more pawns in what has become increasingly a very professionalized game of politics that is played by politicians who are interested in their power, but more and more losing connection with the people that they claim to represent. And then also by 2010, the sense that corruption always goes unpunished, right? Very poor governance, people are becoming more and more hopeless. And democracy doesn't really mean equal opportunity in India anymore, because people are so socioeconomically unequal. How can we talk about equality of opportunity? Right? And we have a lot of discourses like this, especially about the laws. India has very good laws, very extensive laws, but when it comes to implementation, even though constitutionally everybody is equal before law, there are more than enough stories every day, right, about how whether you are held accountable for your crimes or not depends very much on where you stand on the socioeconomic ladder. So what we see over time is that there has been steadily developing a sense of disillusionment with Indian politics. And the democratic backsliding that we do see is in part because of these trends where there has been persistent corruption, persistent inefficiency in the government. Government have not delivered on the promises. Liberal rights and values don't really exist very much in practice, even though they are there in the constitution. And so what we have in India is a consolidated electoral democracy, which also I think the results of this most recent election seem to support. But liberal democracy was never consolidated in India. So in that sense, maybe there hasn't actually been a backsliding. India always was an electoral democracy that hoped to become a liberal democracy one day, but it hasn't succeeded in that so far. It started as an electoral democracy and it remains an electoral democracy. But this disillusionment takes the persistent corruption. It has led to a growing preference for a strong leader, decisive leadership in government, having a more strong state that can make and implement difficult decisions. And I think that partly explains why the BJP was so successful in 2014, because this was their agenda. Yes, they had a lot of the right-wing Hindutva promises, but that is not sort of the biggest support group. They were able to speak to inefficiencies and corruption and promise to correct a lot of those problems in their 2014 campaign. And I think that really resonated with the people, and that explains why they were so popular then. But I will stop there and hopefully have some questions. Yeah, that's okay.
I have a few questions.
Yeah.
First, of course, were you surprised by the results yesterday?
I was, and I have to say, I guess, like a lot of people, I was also quite taken in by the exit polls and just the general direction of travel for the last 10 years. BJP did very well in 2014. They did even better in the next elections in 2019. And so with that, plus everything else that we saw, just how much money they spend on advertising and how much disinformation and propaganda they spread across social media. Yeah, I really thought that they would perform much better than they did.
And this does also mean that we're basically going back to this status quo. So India was for a long time led by coalitions and was now past 10 years under Modi with a single party.
That's right.
Was the exception. Do you feel this is a good, going good for democracy?
I think so. I think in general, especially in societies that are as diverse as India is, coalition governments are perhaps better able to represent a diversity of interests in the parliament. And especially now with how the BJP has governed the last 10 years and this tendency to not really discuss and debate policies in the parliament and then pass them through because they have a majority, that has really undermined parliamentary processes. So I think now it is a coalition government and that has its own challenges, but I think hopefully governance will be a lot more democratic going forward.
You said that the elections were, a lot of it was BJP did have a lot of control on the elections,
Yes.
but still the turnout was different than we expected.
Yeah.
Can you make some assumptions on why people voted as they did?
That's hard to say. I think in general, people take a lot of pride in India in voting. So voter turnout tends to be quite good overall. But in terms of why people voted the way they voted, of course, a lot of data has to come and we have to analyze it. But I think really economic agenda is far more important. And one of the persistent problems, BJP did not create it, but they have also not been able to solve it, is that of unemployment. And unemployment among Indian youth is very, very high. And then there are, other trends like agricultural incomes have actually declined in the last 5 to 10 years. So the farming sector is performing really poorly. And the host of economic challenges that India is facing, despite the successes that the BJP has made, especially through in massive investments in infrastructure that has contributed very. There are these deep structural challenges that even the BJP has not been able to address over 10 years. So I think that has also probably played quite a significant role in how people voted. And this, I don't know if it's a factor. I hope it is, that maybe it's also a rejection of a lot of the hate speech that we saw during these elections. Modi tends to be very quiet on social media. Generally, he does not comment very much. But if you listen to his campaign speech when he's addressing these big rallies, the discourse is just so hateful towards minorities. And I really sincerely hope that people have also, at least in part, voted to reject that kind of hatefulness in Indian society.
I think it's also that more women voted than ever.
Yeah.
How do factors like that play into how people define national identity, how people vote, like gender, religion, region they grow up, generations?
Yeah.
What role does that play?
I think all of these are important factors, and I don't know if I can speculate about which one is more important than the rest. And I think in our data as well, especially over the decades, we have seen this this concern about how much women are oppressed in Indian society. That has been quite a consistent thread, especially in the mass discourse that we see in the movies and the novels. And, you know, I think especially in the last year, there has been a lot more of this oppression of women, especially with what happened in the Northeast, and that, you know, and again, like, I hope that was part of what motivated women also to come out and vote more. But that is one part, like how they are treated in Indian society, and especially with these events in the very recent months. But on the other hand, is again, like women's labor force participation in India is very low and declining. So there are these kinds of problems. And while the Modi government has, again, like they have, you know, given out billions in direct cash transfers and benefits, and a lot of that has been addressed towards women, like, perhaps it is not enough. Yeah.
We do talk a lot about India here at United Switzerland, but rarely about national politics and population would vote, but of course, mostly about geopolitical factors and India as a rising power. And for us, it seems that's very relevant. Do you think this factors into the elections, how India is acting on the global stage? Yeah.
So I think this time, of course, it seems that foreign policy or India's role on the global stage might have been a factor. And certainly, I think maybe the BJP was in some way banking that some people might support it more for its increasing significance in the international arena. G20 was held with so much fanfare, right? And BJP and Modi have also really pushed this narrative about how India is respected today because of BJP and Modi. And India has a seat at the table because of Modi, which I completely disagree with. But again, like, I think it was very much part of the rhetoric of the elections this time, India's place in the world and India's foreign policy. But looking at the numbers, I'm not sure if that was actually on top of the mind of the voters as much as other issues like the economy and unemployment.
Do you think India will still be able with coalition to become a rising power, or will it even help? Will it make it more difficult?
I mean, I think India is already a rising power. I think the question is whether it will ever be able to graduate from this rising power status and become a major power. And I think here it's a little bit, India's importance in the international stage right now is not going to go away depending on who is in office. If the West is willing to engage with India when the BJP had a majority in the parliament and Modi being prime minister with all of his background, then the West will continue to engage with India regardless of who is in office next. I think for India, it's going to be more about, you know, to what extent does it want to be a major power? What are the kinds of responsibilities that it wants to shoulder? And what kinds of benefits does it seek? And maybe with a coalition government or a different government, some of those priorities will shift. But I think for the foreseeable future, India is going to remain quite an important player on the world stage, given its size, if nothing else, but also in the region, in the Indo-Pacific region.
as we talk about national identity, I wanted to ask, this is probably not going to show up in the data set because it ends too early, but there was a bit of a brouhaha last year when there were voices in the Indian government suggesting that the country changed its name from India to Bharat, and it kind of like tanked very well around the G20.
Yeah.
So do you have a sense of sort of how changing a country's name, or how specifically changing India's name, would sort of factor into national identity? Has this been something that's been discussed before? What's your interpretation of why the Indian government, the then Indian government, and probably the next Indian government, so thinks that is important and or productive for what they're trying to achieve?
That's right. So to the best of my memory, in all the many thousands of texts that we coded to construct this data set, that has never been an issue. Like, we have never seen mention of that. Some of the smaller things that, Modi has talked about, like having this self-reliant India, that, especially self-reliance, right? That is not a new thing with Modi. Many previous generations of Indian politicians have talked about that. And so these kinds of things are not new. Or even like, I remember this was very interesting for me to see as well when I was coding this whole phrase that most like to use, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the whole world is one family, right? That was also part of their G20 branding. That is also not unique to Modi. Indira Gandhi has used that before Modi did. And so a lot of these things have been around for a long time, but changing India's name to Bharat has never been an issue. And of course, I think it's also partly why the opposition chose its acronym as India, right, to push back against some of that. But these have not been issues. Like, the issues that have actually been that we see in the data set are more or less very, very consistent over time. And so the 2020 data is not such a radical departure. After 6 years of Modi, we don't see such a big change in the kinds of identities that are prominent in India. And so identities are also things that, change very, very slowly over very long periods of time. And so what we see is a lot more consistency. One of the more prominent changes is really this emergence of this concern that India is becoming authoritarian and non-democratic, and this rising power, major power identity. Those are really the two new things that we observe in the data.
I have more questions. Yes. So you said it that this is a world trend. It's not just India where we have democratic backsliding. Anti-democratic leaders are elected.
Yes.
And the maybe a bit surprising results don't change that. Modi will still be elected for another 5 years. Yeah. But do you see patterns? I mean, South Africa also recently had a single party majority, and with the elections, it changed again to a coalition.
Yeah.
Are there global patterns that you can see?
Yeah. I haven't studied other countries, right? But I think a lot of people are looking at this, and I really think one of the big problems is just how much more people are struggling today. Inequality is rising, and that has been a big problem. And of course, like, populist narratives as well have become quite a big driver of this push towards strong men. These leaders and also very charismatic people, right? Whatever you think of Donald Trump, for example, he pulls people in, he addresses these big rallies, he's very popular among people. And it's just, I think maybe charisma has also part of it, and the kind of narratives that these people are able to build by pulling up very, very real grievances that voters have today, and packaging it into a way that resonates with people. And also, I think, providing very, very clear other groups where we can point the finger, right? So we are struggling because they are taking our jobs away, or because all of these migrants are flooding our borders. So they're very good at providing a scapegoat. And I think these kinds of factors are also partly driving this notion of needing strong states and strong leaders.
Do you feel that, I mean, India has gone down on all the international ratings on democracy. It has slipped down. Do you have hope that this now will change again, or that it will just continue as it was?
Yeah. I mean, I think in general, with a coalition government where power has to be shared with others, there is much less scope for Modi to now be such a, sort of authoritarian kind of leader that he has gained a reputation. So I think we're going to see a lot more negotiation even within the alliance members, and the overall effect of that should be to improve some of these ratings.
There is also one online, but please go ahead and I can read.
So I wanted to ask, also as we end this conversation, it seems like one of the more surprising things about Indian democracy, that while it's flawed and it's not a liberal democracy, but an electoral democracy, it's still here. Within a way surprising given the state of the country that it was in when it became a democracy. I think somebody once told me that there's never been a country that became a democracy with such a low income per capita as India, like not even close. And a lot of people kind of speculated that it wouldn't last.
Yes.
It's proven surprisingly resilient. And again, I think yesterday's results are actually kind of like a show that Indian democracy is still around. So what's the reason for this resilience? Why has India, which is such a vast, complicated, complex, difficult country, why has it been able to uphold a flawed but still a democratic system that does provide checks and balances to a certain degree?
That's right. And it's really, I mean, India has always been considered the exception to this rule about needing a certain level of GDP per capita in order to have democracy consolidate, right? That's a very interesting question. I think maybe some of it at least has to do with the fact that at independence, it was a very, very self-conscious choice that this will be a democratic country where people will have the right to vote, right? And right from the very first election, if you are 18 years of age and an Indian citizen, you could go and cast your vote, right? Women were given the right to vote. Every group in the society was given the right to vote. And I think it has been emphasized so much. If you look at the data, who the politicians who are talking about the democracy the most. So even Narendra Modi reminds us all the time that we are democracy. And what democracy really means is everybody has the right to go and vote. And that has, I think, become such an indelible part of Indian politics. And for better or for worse, like, that also affected the emergence of kind of vote. But it has become a way for people to express their opinion, expand their slice in the pie, and so on. And I think those electoral institutions are just so deeply ingrained that I don't see that changing unless somebody comes and changes the constitution, for example. But I really cannot imagine that would ever be successful.
There is a question about if your data would support the following statement. Left-wing electoral win means no democratic backsliding. Right-wing electoral win means democratic backsliding.
No, the data does not talk about that at all. I think the data helps us understand, why we might go in one direction or the other. And really, I think, the data tells us sort of, how people are thinking about being Indian. And it means that if you are Indian, you have to deal with a lot of corruption, and you have to deal with communalism in your Indian society, and you have to deal with casteism. But it really does not say anything about who is going to win or what does that mean. If we have a left-wing government, that does not automatically mean that India is going to be more or less democratic. Our data is neutral on that.
We have one last short question before we end. After the elections is before the elections, do you think the BJP and Modi, who will be at the time of the next elections, I think 78 years old, already plans? So you think they already made plans on how to tackle the next elections?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they have talked about it. And whatever their plans were, I think they will have to take a very hard look at those plans given this election outcome. I think if I just think about how the BJP approached it, I don't think they were expecting such a defeat. Like maybe their hope of winning 400 was a bit too ambitious, but I don't know if they seriously accounted for the possibility of losing as many seats as they have this time. And so this is going to have to affect their planning for the next election. And I would imagine they will start very, very soon with planning for 2029.